Hi, my name is Bronson McDonald, and I'm working with the Estes Park Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. We are working on an oral history project of all the climbers in Estes Park. It's going to be the history of each climber, starting back as far back as the present day climbers that are alive. So today I will be interviewing Mr. Mike Caldwell, and he is an amazing climber. He's been here for quite a while, and we will get some information about him. And once again, I said my name is Bronson McDonald, and I've been living here in Estes Park on and off since 1992. And I moved here when I was a beginner climber, and this was the second place I got to climb at, and this is the foundation of my climbing. And it's an amazing place to start and learn. And there's every single type of climbing, from ice climbing to bouldering and everything in between, trad climbing, sport climbing. And I feel very fortunate to live here. So let me introduce you to Mr. Mike Caldwell, and he is going to tell you all about himself and why he is climbing here in Estes Park, Colorado. Hi, Mike. My name is Bronson McDonald. It's great to see you again. I've known you, since 1992 is when I first met you.
Apparently.
Yes. So, Mike, today we are doing an oral history of climbing in Estes Park, and this is for the Estes Park Valley Library and the Estes Park Museum. And to introduce yourself, I would love it if you can tell me your first and last name, where were you born, and what is your birth date, what month you were born, date and year, and then from there, just let me know what your career has been, and then we're going to talk about climbing and the history of climbing with you.
My name is Michael Allen Caldwell. I was born in San Jose, California in July 13th, 1950. I've lived in Estes Park it'll be 30 years next June. I started climbing when I was 13 years old, came out here right after college, and we can fill in the details and all that as much as you like.
Perfect. I like that. What year did you move to Estes Park?
I moved to Estes in 1982. Okay. I lived in Loveland 10 years before that.
Nice. When you lived in Loveland, you mentioned you started climbing when you were 13 years old?
Correct.
Where was the first place you started climbing at?
When I was 13, I was a Boy Scout on a trip in the Sierras, and we saw some people climbing in the minarets. And they came into our campsite and talked about what they were doing. So as soon as our trip was over, I went out and bought a rope and a copy of Freedom of the Hills and talked a bunch of other 13-year-olds into risking their lives, and off we went.
That's pretty exciting. That's pretty bold. How did your parents take it when you said, "I'm going climbing, Mom," at 13 years old?
They didn't fully understand what it was, what it was that I was doing.
I can imagine. So you mentioned that you lived in Loveland before you moved to Estes Park in 1982. What did you do in Loveland?
Well, I moved to Loveland right out of college because I got a middle school teaching job in Loveland. I ended up teaching in the same district and basically the same building for the entire time. So I taught for 30 years. The first 10 years I lived there. The last 20 years I lived in Estes and commuted down the hill to teach.
Very nice. What did you teach?
In 30 years, it was more energizing for me to periodically reinvent myself. So I kept certifying in different areas, and I never taught math or music.
Wow.
Pretty much everything else, though.
Very nice. Oh, that's great. So in 1982, you moved up to Estes Park. And before that, you were living in Loveland, and I assumed you were coming up to Estes Park all the time to go rock climbing in the Rocky Mountain National Park and the surrounding areas. What brought you here? Was it the climbing, or was it your job?
When I moved out from California, I wanted to teach in a place where I could coach gymnastics and where there was rock climbing. So rock climbing was definitely at least half of the equation. And the gymnastics kind of fizzled because the state of Colorado lost their momentum with gymnastics, and so I ended up climbing a whole lot more than I was coaching gymnastics.
Very cool. Excuse me. Did you do gymnastics since you were a young boy also?
I started in college. The high school I went to didn't have gymnastics. I was a wrestler in high school, and at Cal, I went to the University of California, Berkeley, they had the best gymnastics program in the nation and maybe the worst wrestling program in the nation. So I just walked down the hall one day and never came back.
Oh, that's great. So it sounds like you've had quite an athletic career since you were a young boy. And then in college, I mean, you went into wrestling and gymnastics. And as we know in the climbing world, gymnastics is such a huge, and wrestling, huge foundation for climbing and building more like an all-around athlete. And in climbing skills are so relative to gymnastic skills. Have you found that to be enhancing your climbing abilities?
Well, like most gymnasts, I'm kind of vertically challenged. And in gymnastics, you learn to do a lot of dynamic moves. And so my climbing style involves a lot of leaps and grabs and so forth. And it feels like some of the things I did in gymnastics for sure. So yeah, it really has made a difference. And flexibility really helps. And I'm still pretty flexible, so it stuck with me.
That's good to hear. All right, so now you're living in Estes Park. You moved here in 1982, and you have so many rocks surrounding you. What has been your favorite area in Estes Park to climb at? And also, I know from knowing you, your history, you have done a lot of route developing. What route is your favorite? What area? Give me a little history about you climbing in this area.
Well, I love the Diamond. Since I guided for the Colorado Mountain School for a number of years, I believe I've done the Diamond on the order of 50 times. Mostly the casual route, of course, but I've done 6 or 8 other routes on the Diamond. Several with Tommy, where all I could do was Jumar lately. But I started off very focused on the Diamond. I love Lumpy Ridge, particularly Sundance. I've climbed there a lot. I love developing obscure crags in the park. Got some some crags that nobody knows about that have got some really good climbs on them up in the park. And, so I've got them written down, so someday they'll be more public, I suppose. I've loved developing the monastery. Have loved developing the Renaissance Canyon over by the Book. I've got one of my favorite routes is on Sundance, Cirque du Soleil. It's a 11D or 12A that Tommy recently repeated, and he thought it was hard to protect. When I did it, I really fiddled the gear in and seemed okay at the time. But if he says it's hard to protect, I kind of take that as a compliment. But there has been an awful lot of new route development, and my favorite areas have, I've been here long enough that they've changed. I still love Lumpy Ridge.
Lumpy Ridge is a pretty amazing place. What year did Cirque du Soleil go up?
Cirque du Soleil went up probably in 2003, and it starts up guillotine. You make the first couple of hard moves on guillotine, then you branch out right, and you follow a real thin R-piece. There's a 2-bolt belay just off of guillotine, but then you climb a real long RP seam that has, I think, 5 bolts carefully spaced in case you were to rip all the RPs, because there are some gaps in the cracks. And it's 11C right up to this little roof move, and the roof moves pretty hard, 11D or 12A. And then the subsequent pitches continue straight up at about the 510 or 510 plus level and finish pretty much where Coors Flake finishes. But I think that was 2003.
Okay, and how many pitches is this route?
Really 4.
4?
If you stretch out the 3 independent pitches, yeah, it's 4.
That's great. It sounds pretty exciting, I bet, especially when your son, who, as we know, Tommy is a world-renowned climber, putting up new routes, putting up first ascents all over, and he says to you, Dad, that route was really hard to protect. That's a huge compliment.
Well, I was using a lot of little tricams. I think I used a slider nut. I used some ball nuts. I mean, some really exotic pro to sew it up. And I don't think Tommy was carrying quite as complete a rack as I was, and that probably made a difference.
Definitely. Oh, that's pretty neat. So, Mike, you said it's hard to protect, and as we're both climbers, we totally understand what that means. But how would you describe hard to protect to some common person that's never rock climbed before, that watched, that's maybe a huge NFL fan? Mm-hmm. How would you describe it?
Well, when you're leading up the rock with the rope trailing down from you, you need to place solid anchors in the rock and attach the rope to them with carabiners so that you don't fall to the ground or fall further than you'd prefer to fall. And so as you climb, you place gear usually on granite in the cracks. Well, this particular crack is very thin and very shallow, so I'm using very tiny protection that doesn't fit in there very well. And I might put a piece of gear that will hold several hundred pounds and hopefully more every 6 to 10 feet in a crack like that, so I can't fall any further than 12 to 20 feet, let's say. But in this particular case, it was difficult getting good gear in frequently, good nuts or good cams in frequently enough to feel real good about it. At least Tommy thought so. I thought I had protected it okay when I did it.
Okay. Well, that's good. That's good to hear. And a piece of gear for the common person, is that like a little piece of metal that you would slide into a crack? And this little piece of metal, it does have attachments, and it's completely strong enough to like hold, in a sense, a couple body weights. How would you describe a piece of gear?
Usually we're using little aluminum wedges that you find V-shaped slots in the crack, and you put a V-shaped wedge in a V-shaped slot, and since a fall puts a downward force on that nut, things should hold. But for some of the very small nuts, the force on the rock is great, and the rock can fail. On some of the real small ones, the wires that the aluminum wedges are attached to are so thin that you can break the wires. And so it can be sketchy for a variety of reasons.
Wow, that's pretty exciting. Yeah. So you have done, before Cirque du Soleil, you've done a lot of development. You mentioned the monastery. And I remember back in the early 90s hearing about you and another person taking a helicopter or a single engine airplane ride above, flying around looking for crags. Give us a little history of how you would find new areas to develop, and then mention what type of development did you do? Because I know Cirque du Soleil was a trad route, meaning you place gear. Is the monastery like that also, or what type of climbing is the monastery?
I was not in on the helicopter ride to find the monastery. Lawrence Stemke and Todd Jersa, I believe. Todd's the head of the school board, president of the school board here in Estes Park right now, but Todd wasn't always just the president of the school board. He's, I believe, a pilot as well. But Lawrence and Todd took that airplane flight and discovered this crag up on Storm Mountain years ago. Gosh, we used to just hike all over the place, and anything that looked like it might have a climb on it, we'd chase it down, and usually it didn't pan out, but occasionally it would. Anyway, Lawrence and Todd discovered the crag, and Lawrence started hiking in there, and it took a long time for him to find an efficient way to hike in there. It's a pretty good hike. The rocks there do not have many cracks, so you cannot protect them traditionally in very many cases. There are a couple of climbs that require some traditional nut placements, but most of the climbs are sport climbs where you're drilling holes with a Bosch drill and placing an expansion bolt that'll hold several thousand pounds, usually every 6 to 10 feet. So it's a much safer kind of climbing, and since it's so safe, you can do very, very difficult climbs there. And the monastery has a couple of the hardest climbs in Colorado.
Yes, I've looked at the guidebook, and I've also climbed there, and I've noticed some of the hardest there. It's pretty amazing. And did you send some of those?
I bolted the hardest climb at the monastery is Grand Ole Opry. And which we originally, in the history of Grand Ole Opry, is we went in there one day and I put anchors at the top and lowered down, and it was able to wiggle a few little wired pieces of pro into funky little places. It's a radically overhanging wall. And we came back a few days later, and you can tell when you're establishing a route that there are certain good holds near which you'll want to place bolts so that you can make the clips. So I put in bolts, about 11 of them, I think, on Grand Ole Opry, all the bolts by what seemed to be the best holds. And then that same day, Tommy top roped it once and then sent it on the second try. Now, since then, and Steve Hong and George Squibb were there that day to witness all this, so that, it's not just coming from me, but we at the time rated it 14B. People nowadays are calling it 14B or C. So it's pretty hard climb.
Wow. So as we know you and I know what the climbing rating scales are, 14B/C, in the grand realm of it, that would be one of the hardest things in this area, hardest type of climbing. Can you describe a little bit about the grading for climbing?
Well, the grading system in the United States is the Yosemite decimal system. It started in Yosemite. Just as a starting point, walking on flat ground is grade 1. Walking up a rough trail would be class 2. Scrambling without a rope would be class 3, and it goes on up to 5th class climbing, where you're wearing a rope and you're attaching it to anchors in the rock that catch you if you're going to fall. And originally, the easiest 5th class climbs were called 5.0, and 5.1 was a little harder, 5.2 was a little harder, and originally the scale topped out at 5.9. But then they started doing climbs, mostly in Yosemite, but one here by a fellow named George Hurley in El Dorado, that was harder than any of these 5.9. So they invented the grade of 5.10. Well, initially they were unwilling to expand the grades endlessly, so as harder and harder climbs developed, they would call them 5.10A, 5.10B, 5.10C, and 5.10D. But D was so much harder than A that after D, they went to 5.11A. Well, as the system continued to progress, we'd got 5.11 ABCD, 5.12 ABCD, 5.13 ABCD, 5.14 ABCD, and now 5.15A and maybe B.
Wow. That is really, really impressive. So at the monastery, you put up the Grand Ole Opry, and at a 5.14 BC, super, super hard. And your son did the first ascent of this. And did you belay him when he did the first ascent? How, as a father and son duo, from knowing a little bit about you, you have encouraged your family. You guys have been a super outdoor family. When did you start taking your family out to go rock climbing?
Well, Tommy climbed the bowels of the Owls when he was 3 in order to fly a kite from the top. And, we did a lot of little top rope things. There's photos around of Tommy in some real baggy Lycra climbing, actually leading after 7 in Yosemite when he was about 7. And I was jumaring alongside while somebody else belayed so that I could really evaluate the protection as Tommy put it in. So he was leading when he was 7. Then from about that time onward, we really decided not to pressure him to climb too much. So he tried all the other traditional school-based sports. But by the time he was 12 or so, he had chosen climbing. He was back into it. And so we went out and climbed the diamond together. And he didn't lead any of the pitches on the diamond then, but he did climb the diamond when he was 12, and from that point on, it was just crazy. We built a climbing wall at the middle school that I taught at, and he came down to Loveland to attend middle school with me, and so he was working out on that wall and talked to a whole bunch of friends many of whom subsequently became really well-known climbers, particularly Mike Aldridge and Adam Stack and John Stack. But so they became really, and Mike Ray. So we developed this great climbing team, and by the time he was 14, we had the chance to go to South America and Europe, and he was doing very well then, and then things just went crazy. When he was just about to turn 16, they were holding the Snowbird Invitational over in Snowbird, Utah, which at the time was the World Championship. And you could only go by invitation. And Tommy had had a real good week climbing in Colorado that week. He had climbed Slice of Life in Rifle, and had climbed a couple of real hard climbs in the Logan Canyon with Chris Sharma. And we decided to go, and we've known Chris since they were both little kids. And so we decided to go to Snowbird and get some autographs of his heroes. So we drove out there, and the day before they held a citizens competition. So we said, what the heck, Tommy, why don't you enter the citizens comp? And these competitions were set up on the outside of the buildings with 110 feet tall climbs. And some of them were little holes that were glued onto the walls or chipped into the walls. But the main climbing wall where the big competition events were held was like a modern climbing wall where you bolted holes on. Anyway, so basically it worked out. Tommy won the Citizens Comp on Saturday, and then we discovered that whoever wins the Citizens Comp on Saturday was automatically entered in the Invitational on Sunday. Well, so then he won Snowbird on Sunday, and all of a sudden he was on the scene.
Wow. And what year was that?
96, I'm guessing, something like.
Okay. That's pretty neat. I mean, what a great accomplishment to, be a father and have a son that you start climbing at 3 years old, doing the bowels of the owls, so he can go fly a kite on the top, which that's really entertaining. Do you have a picture of that?
We do somewhere, but it was kind of a stormy day, and actually the kite took off. We lost it.
Oh, that's great. And what a neat thing to be able to, continue to grow with your son and climb all over the world together and be partners. And I mean, what a great accomplishment.
Well, I was trying to videotape that Snowbird competition, and as they went through the preliminary rounds of the Invitational, Tommy had flashed everything. And he was basically the last person to climb in the finals. And when I realized he had surpassed the high point, which I believe was J.B. Trabeau, pretty good climber, the camera started shaking, and I dropped the camera. So Tommy actually topped out on the route, but I don't have a shot of that. I was so excited I couldn't believe it. As close as I can recall ever to coming to a heart attack.
That's good. You came to almost close coming to a heart attack watching your son climb. Any close calls in the mountains?
I've been present when there was a lot of other parties parallel to us with serious accidents. Never really had serious. I mean, Tommy knocked down a rock one time at the Fortress of Solitude, and I needed a couple of stitches. That wasn't any particular big deal. Held some long falls that Tommy took. When Tommy did Just Do It at Smith Rock, the protection is very far apart, and to have minimal rope drag, we had a really skinny rope, and it stretched like crazy. And so Tommy took a fall right at the crux where he was, maybe 20 feet above his last piece of protection, but with rope stretch, he ended up going about 50 feet. And a very safe, clean fall. And he's taking much longer falls than that now on the Don Wall and El Capitan, but got my attention. It's probably the longest fall I've held.
Wow. That definitely would get your attention.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's your kid, geez.
And it's your son.
Yeah.
Have you ever been struck by lightning or?
I've actually taken ground shocks a number of times, and I had an incident on Spearhead where my hair caught fire from static, and I burned off the hair on the front of my head. That would probably was my closest call, actually, in the mountains. But there were no real injuries. I was guiding that on that occasion, and so I tied my two clients together and I lowered them down 150 feet, and I was preparing to rappel down to them to just get low, as far away from the storm that just blew in with no warning. But before I could rappel down to them, I had that little fire accident.
Oh my goodness.
But I took a real good ground shock at Enchanted Rock in Texas one time. I mean, I was in I was in the lightning position, all crouched up, and took a little arc through a rock that was near me, and all my joints were bent before the shock, and they all straightened out from the shock. So I took this huge jump, a totally unintended jump from the ground shock. But those would count as close calls, I guess.
So Mike, you were mentioning about some different obscure areas in the park and different experiences, and I mean, you have so much passion about climbing. What are some of these areas? Can you describe some of the places in the park?
Okay, one of my two favorite areas in the park is a buttress that is to the west of Notch Top, on the other side, on the west side of the West Gully. And this buttress is probably 4 to 5 pitches tall, and we've put up a couple of good routes on there. There's at least 3 more lines there. We called the buttress Point Elway, after Colorado's most illustrious citizen. All this development was done with Glenn Dunmire. But we did the first route we did there, we called Student Body Right, which is a 4-pitch 510 plus that has off-width through a roof on it and some great corner climbing and a wonderful finger crack. The base of this buttress is just lush, flat grass. I mean, it's like climbing off of a golf course. The rock needs a little bit of cleaning, but there is ample room for a lot more new routes there. I would sure take some small wires though for any of the other routes. The reason we've done the couple of routes there that we've done is because we didn't need tiny RPs, but I think you would need them for the routes that are more to the left. Another thing that we've climbed and really enjoyed is up off of Old Fall River Road. If you look up at the spires above Old Fall River Road, one is particularly tall and white. And so we call that spire the Great White. And I was with a friend named Mick Scarpella, and we did a route that starts at the very lowest point of that spire and then finishes on the summit. It's also probably about 4 pitches and about 510 plus. Wonderful climb, and it's clean as a whistle. We did find signs of people having rappelled off of it. So we were not the first ever to summit that spire, but I'm pretty sure we were the first ones to do the climb we did. And you could put up an incredible bolted arête on the south arête of that spire. Would be an amazing, amazing route. Actually, a third one that Tommy and I recently did is up by Box Lake. This is a spire that we called Marathon Man because the round trip hike to Box Lake is 17 miles. So it's a long ways in. But it's a freestanding spire that sticks up above Box Lake. The route we did is probably 11C or D on the south face of that spire. Tommy top roped a couple of 513s on it. There's probably a 510 wide crack that comes up out of the notch. It's an amazing spire, and there's a lot more rock up there. But you sure have to like to hike.
It sounds like it, especially 17 miles.
And there was no signs of anybody
Wow.
having ever been on the summit. So we left the summit anchor, and I'm sure that we were the first ones ever to be on top of that spire.
That's pretty neat, especially being the first one.
And I mean, it is almost the magnitude of the Lost Arrow. I mean, show you what a big spire it is. And I mean, it's a real tall, slender shaft with no easy ways up.
How did you find that, and where is Box Lake?
Box Lake is up in Wild Basin. It's as you're heading the last couple of miles to Thunder Lake, there's a canyon on the left. It's the canyon that you head up to get to Eagle's Beak and some of those classic mountaineering areas up in there. So it's the same canyon there, and it's on the, I believe the spire is actually on the south side of Tanima Peak, right over Box Lake though.
Oh, very neat. And can you give an example, when you say pitch, what does a pitch represent on a climb? Like, how many feet is that?
A pitch is the distance between belays, which kind of means I need to explain a belay. Belay is where one climber anchors himself and holds the rope to protect the other climber as the other climber proceeds, either up above or in coming up to that climber. A pitch is a rope's length of climbing. And if you have two ledges 30 feet apart, it might only be a 30-foot pitch. But in many cases, you'll have pitches that are really, really long because there are no stances from which to belay. And one of the things that has evolved in Tommy's style is even the big walls that he's doing in Yosemite, he wants all the pitches to be from natural stances to natural stances. So we've got some hugely long ropes. I was up on the Diamond earlier this summer belaying Tommy on a 240-foot, actually 260-foot pitch, where we had to do some funny logistics tying ropes together so that he could do them all in one pitch.
Wow, that's pretty neat.
So they can, modern day pitches can be 30 feet long or they can be 260 feet long.
Okay.
Or anywhere in between.
Wow.
But it's the distance between stances.
Okay, I like that. So the 4-pitch spires that you were doing could be, realistically, you would think it's probably 4 to 600 feet tall?
Yeah, that would be a good guess. And I would say 500 for both would be right on.
That's pretty neat. So you're hiking 17 miles, and then you go climb like 500 feet, 600 feet. And then do you get back that day, or are you sleeping overnight?
I have not had to bivvy in the park in a long, long time. Bivvy is bivouac, sleeping overnight, usually without adequate gear. It's very little sleeping and a whole lot of shivering usually. But in the early days when I was here, I wanted every climb to include a bivouac, so we would bivvy all over the place. But I don't believe I've probably bivouacked in the park in 15 years.
Oh my goodness.
So everything's got to be done in a day.
That's nice. Yeah, that seems nice, because then you can come home and have dinner.
Yeah.
Yep. So climbing in Estes Park, and you've climbed all over the world. This is your home in Estes Park, and how has climbing here in the community, since you've been here, well, you were climbing here before 1982 when you lived in Loveland, but how have you seen the climbing community change, and has it been for the good or for the negative? What have you noticed about Estes Park climbing community?
Well, when I first moved to Estes Park, the climbers here were Mike Covington, Steve Comito, Douglas Snively, all a bunch of well-known climbers, many of whom I bet will be interviewed for this project, but there weren't many others. You'd run into people who came in from out of town at the Lumpy Ridge parking lot, but the climbing community centered either around the Colorado Mountain School or around Comito Boots, which in those days was located out at Beaver Point. Um, but as time has gone on, of course, there are a lot more climbers, and with the climbing wall at the Estes Park Mountain Shop, that's become a focal point, and Notch Top is a focal point. Ed's Cantina is a focal point. There are lots of places where climbers meet, and so the climbing community is much more diverse. Not a whole lot of communication though between the rock climbers and the mountaineers. It's kind of split up, and you're in your situation. You're probably more of a hub of the community than I am, for sure. Just because because you work at Ed's and a lot of them come in there, I bet you see a bigger variety of climbers than I do here in town.
Definitely, I think I do. We definitely get a whole variety, from the classic alpine mountaineer, ice climber, that whole spectrum, to all the young boulderers, international boulderers. It's pretty fun when a lot of the Japanese or Europeans come over. I definitely see a lot of that. But it's from the time period I've lived here, I've seen a huge change. And I can only imagine with your eyes, you have seen from where it's only your group of guys, and I would assume every once in a while there'd be a couple girls coming in and out, where today there's so many more diversity of age and of the sexes, male and female. Does your wife climb with you?
In the early days, I dragged her up a lot of things that I'm not sure she wanted to be there. We did some multi-pitch climbs in Yosemite, and when she was working for the Colorado Mountain School, they wanted her to be familiar with a lot of the trips that they took. So she summited Popocatépetl and has been up Longs and done a number of things. She has some orthopedic issues right now that are slowing her down, but she a couple of years ago, in fact, to celebrate her 60th birthday, she retook up rock climbing and was doing 10 Cs in the gym. So that was good. She's still little and doesn't have very much to lift, and so she did well. In the Estes Park community, particularly as centered around the mountain shop, so many of the good climbers have been girls. Paige Clausen is a superstar, and there have been a whole bunch of others who, as kids, were that close to Paige. Really, there is an astounding female climbing community here. I would say that in many ways it surpasses the men's climbing community.
Really? That's pretty neat.
And that includes you.
Well, I might be one of the old timers. I'm getting a little older too. But yeah, it's pretty neat to see the younger girls that are being exposed to climbing and that are getting out there and doing it. And it's pretty neat because you coached the Estes Park climbing team for a while. How did that get started, and how many years did you do that? And was your son involved too?
Tommy was older than the age kids of the Estes Park climbing team, so he was not a part of that. I did it for a couple of years. So many of the kids were doing so many different activities that it was really hard. It was like herding cats. It was just hard keeping everybody together, getting everybody to show up for the meets. We had a great team when we all showed up, but it was sure hard getting everybody to show up. And so we parted ways after a couple of years, but it was a wonderful experience, and I still set roots down there. Well, right now, once or twice a week. So I'm, continuing to spend a lot of time in the mountain shop.
That's good. You definitely, I really have enjoyed climbing your routes because I noticed that you have a really good sequential movement, meaning it's like a dance flow on the wall, and you have to really think when you're climbing your routes. I have to think a lot when I climb your routes, and it's beautiful, and it's like a choreographed dance, which I think is really neat, and it's always hard. So,
that gym is steep.
Yes.
And so it's hard not to set a route that's harder than you think. I try to rate my climb's a little softer than some of the other people who set there, because I think the ratings are really out of control sometimes. You know, some of the route setters are 6'6", and it's hard for somebody 6'6" to set a route for a fourth grader. And so I do try to keep short people in mind as I set my routes. But I even put required sequences in 5/7s and 5/8s. So if a beginning climber reaches up with their right hand when they should be reaching up with their left hand, they've got a problem.
That is great. Oh, I like that. Nice. And so you've done quite a bit of different things in the climbing world. I mean, and in teaching, and you can see that coming through with your setting routes. And then you've been a climbing guide at the Colorado Mountain School. So your life is climbing primarily.
A little bit of fly fishing.
Oh, okay. Have you been fly fishing as long as climbing?
Not as long as climbing, but I was given a fly rod by a client who I took to Aconcagua with the mountain school years ago, and so I started fishing my way home from my teaching job in Loveland. So I'd fished my way up the canyon for about 20 years. And as my teaching career was winding down, I thought I would get into a type of guiding that had fewer liability issues than mountain guiding. So these days I probably guide fly fishing, 120 days a year. But I still do mountain type guiding 40 days a year, perhaps, something like. A lot of snowshoe trips in the wintertime, and some non-technical ascents of longs. So I still do longs several times a summer. And then I do some technical things on longs when Tommy needs a belayer.
That's great. So you still keep going to the climbing outdoors. And how often do you still climb today?
It probably works out to twice a week, but I'm much happier when I can do it 3 or 4 times a week.
Yeah, I could see that. And in your climbing experience, what's the hardest thing you've climbed? And then do you see, as you become older, is there any decrease in your climbing abilities, or are you still finding new things new challenges, and are you climbing harder?
Hard comes in so many different forms. It's hard to say what the hardest thing I've climbed is. I did the Rainbow Wall years ago, which is a 513 when there weren't too many 513s. And it's really more like just a big boulder problem. It's a short, that's in El Dorado Canyon. I've done a lot of big walls in Yosemite with, some of the people who subsequently became famous, Vern Clevenger and Dale Bard and some of those people. So some of those were pretty hard. My climbing career was interrupted by a bodybuilding career, and I got my body weight up to well over 200 pounds. And so in the middle of my climbing career, after climbing with Dale and Vern, I had this fit of craziness, where I gained a lot of body weight and, gave that a try. I was really trying to see if all this stuff that I'd learned in my exercise physiology classes in college really was going to work or not. And it seemed like it did. But I did that for a while, then I got a bicep injury and went back into climbing. Now, while I weighed over 200 pounds, I did do some really good mountaineering. Did a really fast ascent of Orizaba, like 2-hour ascent, super, super fast. Did some things in South America really fast. So I was really into sort of speed mountaineering in those days. But now, now I'm just climbing for fun, doing a lot of sport climbing. For the last 15 years, I've wanted to really feel like I was comfortable on 512. And the last 7 trips I've made to the climbing gyms in Boulder, I've done 512s every trip. So I'm kind of in the middle of I'm not sure why it's happening, but I'm enjoying it, and I'm going to do everything I can to keep it going.
That's awesome. Oh my goodness. That is
You know,
great.
and you know, as the here we have winter coming on, if the weather lets me, I'm going to try to carry over on this. I've got some outdoor things that I've got my eye on that I want to try and see if I can climb at that level outside. But at least in the gym, I'm pulling pretty good for the moment.
That is great to hear. And what, if I remember correctly, weren't you Mr. Colorado?
Well, that was part of the bodybuilding thing. Yeah, that was in there.
That's and exercise physiology classes. What was some of the ideas that they were teaching in, like thinking about the strength gains? Did that help climbing at all, do you think, or did that affect you? I mean, that's a lot of weight on your fingers if you're weighed 220 pounds.
I was not a good rock climber at over 200 pounds, but a lot of the things that I'm doing with Tommy, like I invented might not be the right word, but I came up with a plyometric system of grip strength training. And plyometrics is, you'll see jumpers use plyometrics, or basketball players, where they'll put a row of benches across a gym, and the jumpers will start off standing on a bench, jump down to the floor and right up onto the next bench, down to the floor and right up onto the next bench. And you can rest on top of the benches, but when you hit the floor, you have to rebound. And the idea is that if you stretch a muscle with impact right before contracting it, you activate more muscle fibers. Well, so I have Tommy do a similar thing on the campus board, where he starts off on rung 2, drops to 1, rebounds to 3, drops to 2, rebounds to 4, drops to 3, rebounds to 5. And so that's a plyometric system, has tremendous injury potential for people who don't have a good strength background. It's not something beginners should try to use as a shortcut to getting real strong real fast, because you could really get some finger injuries this way. But you do it on the biggest rungs of the campus board, and it's pretty good. I also came up with a plate-loaded gripping machine that I have out in the garage that's pretty nifty, because unlike most gripping machines where your skin gets sore, your skin never gets sore on this thing, and you can do it to exercise your fingers, or you can really work your thumbs. And so it's really good for pinch strength. So yeah, I have applied my exercise physiology knowledge in a couple of ways that I think Tommy's benefited from. And he takes the plate-loaded gripping machine with him on trips a lot of the time. He didn't take it with him to Yosemite this time, but he does take it with him. He likes it.
That's really cool. And do you use it also?
You know, I'm climbing often enough, and as the years go on, I need longer recovery time. And so I'm really getting, I think, all the training I can handle from the cardio and the weight training I do in weight gyms, and then the 2 days a week that I spend in climbing gyms. You know, I'm usually pretty creaky for a couple of days after going to the climbing gym. So I'm not using it at the moment. I might, though.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. That's really neat. And as you mentioned, so I'm curious, you've been climbing for how many years now?
Well, since I was 13, that would be 50 years.
Wow.
Darn near.
Oh, that's cool.
49 years.
Wow. That is really neat. And I mean, you've seen it change so much. And you're mentioning about your own personal recovery time. As you've been climbing for 49, 50 years, after climbing 2 days indoors or outdoors, how long does it take for you to recover?
I like 72 hours. I mean, I can, if I've had a real hard workout, I'm okay in 48 hours, but I might be great in 72 hours.
So all those little projects you want to send, you wait 72 hours after.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. And this coming winter, spring, any big trips planned?
Well, we may have a grandchild come along, and then so that's going to take priority when we see how how that pregnancy develops, and so that's really going to steer the schedule more than anything else. But even though I bolted Psychotomic at the monastery, I haven't climbed it. I would really like to do Psychotomic.
I think that would be a
Have
good
you done
goal.
Psychotomic?
I have fallen off Psychotomic. I can do it in 2 pitches. Yeah, that route is beautiful. It's very, very technical and hard, and long moves. So I personally am training with a personal trainer 1 day a week, trying to get my strength up so I can do longer moves, because I have a -1 ape index. And ape index is the span between between both fingertips, arms stretched out, that measures your height equals.
It's arm
minus
span
or-
compared to height.
Yeah, and
And a -1 means your arm span is 1 inch less than you are tall.
yes, and
I have a
really-
-8 index as well.
Whew, so you have to get strong. So I'm working towards that. I have quite a few goals too, but I think Psychotomic would be an amazing.
Or maybe we have to team up.
I think that would be great. We could have well, I turned 40 this year, and I've been climbing for 22 years, and it's been my goal ever since I was younger. I said, oh, when I turn 40, that's when I'll climb 513. Well, I'm 40, so I guess it's time to actually achieve that goal.
To get after it.
So Psychotomic would be a good step right before 513, because I personally think it might be 513.
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows?
Yeah, it's kind of relevant. But I think we should team up and go out there, and that would be really fun.
It'd be fun.
Yeah.
We've got 4 minutes left on this particular.
Okay, so you what has the motivation of climbing done for you, and is that the biggest part in your life, and why is it more important than teaching and fly fish guiding? Like, how has that kind of wrapped your life all in one?
You know, whatever I'm doing at the moment is the most important thing that's going on. But when I'm climbing, you know, not having a tremendous amount of artistic gifts, it's as close as I come to being artistic, because every climb is different, and you know, solving the problem and fitting your own set of skills into whatever the rock has to offer, and then making it all come together, and then maintaining the fitness, you know, and all the dietary things you have to do, and you know, staying healthy. You know, it's an all-encompassing artistic experience, and you know, whether it's mountaineering or easy rock climbing or sport climbing or bouldering, that's really it. It combines sport and art for me in a way that nothing else I can think of does. Fly fishing, not far off though. I mean, the mentality is very similar, and a lot of good climbers are pretty serious fly fishermen as well.
That's really neat. I like that. Well, thank you very much, Mike. And I look forward to climbing with you one day, Psychotomic. And I'm really excited that you're so passionate about it, and you do have such a presence in our community of Estes Park. And the younger generation looks up to you, the older generation does. You have made such a mark in our wonderful climbing community in the Rocky Mountain National Park and the surrounding little crags. It's really neat. So thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.